Today in the Daily Dose, American Westward Expansion. In 1801, after Spain secretly returned the Louisiana Territory to France, Americans grew ever more fearful that Napoleon Bonaparte had plans to tighten his hold on New Orleans and vital shipping routes along the Mississippi, prompting President Thomas Jefferson to write in a letter to Robert Livingston, the U.S. Minister to France, that the day France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. A year later, after Spain revoked a U.S.-Spanish treaty granting Americans the right to store goods in New Orleans, Jefferson sent future U.S. President James Monroe to Paris, where Livingston had previously been tasked with negotiating the purchase of New Orleans for an estimated ceiling price of $10 million. Instead, due to France's weakened economy and Napoleon's impending war with Great Britain, even before Monroe's ship arrived into France, in April of 1803, Livingston was taken by surprise when French officials asked him if the U.S. might be interested in purchasing the entirety of the Louisiana Territory, some 828,000 square miles of pristine land, thereby doubling the size of the young republic. Upon Monroe's arrival, negotiations came to a rapid conclusion when in late April, the team of U.S. emissaries agreed to pay $15 million for what would later become all or part of 15 American states. Dated April 30th and signed on May 2nd, the U.S. Senate ratified the purchase in October of 1803, which was officially transferred by France the following month. Purchased for less than 3 cents an acre, the Louisiana Purchase proved to be one of Jefferson's most notable achievements while in office, which in turn unleashed a near immediate flood of westward explorers onto lands once the sole domain of Native American peoples. In response to the nation's new territory, Jefferson tasked his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to explore the new lands west of the Mississippi. Lewis chose his good friend William Clark to co-lead the expedition, who in turn recruited and trained unmarried healthy men at Fort Dubois during the winter of 1803. On May 14, 1804, the Corps, as they became known, set out in keelboats down the Missouri River with 45 recruits, a French Indian interpreter, a contracted boat crew, and a slave named York. During their 8,000-mile journey, Lewis and Clark encountered nearly 50 Native American tribes, and while violence was rare, in September of 1804, the Teton Sioux attempted to block the group's boats by demanding a toll, which was quickly repulsed by the Corps' superior firepower. Wintering for 5 months after building Fort Mandan in present-day Washburn, North Dakota, Lewis and Clark hired Toussaint Charbonneau as their new interpreter, allowing the trapper's Shoshone wife Sacagawea to join the expedition, who would later prove invaluable to the Corps' survival. On April 7, 1805, Lewis and Clark sent a portion of their crew back towards St. Louis with a keelboat laden with zoological and botanical samples, maps, and letters, while the remaining party pushed across the Continental Divide and the Bitterroot Mountains, which exposed the group to frostbite, hunger, dehydration, bad weather, freezing temperatures, and exhaustion. Despite the brutal conditions, not a single man was lost. Reaching the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805, the expedition wintered near present-day Astoria, Oregon, building Fort Clatsop for a second hard winter to come, before heading for home on March 23, 1806. Splitting into 2 parties in Montana, Clark carved his name and date on a large rock formation along the Yellowstone River, which is now a national monument protected by the Department of the Interior. The 2 teams of explorers reunited on August 12th, arriving back in St. Louis on September 23rd. Lewis and Clark's 2-year expedition produced invaluable maps and geographical information about the American Northwest, while returning home with some 120 animal specimens and over 200 botanical samples, making the Lewis and Clark expedition a landmark precursor to a young nation's all-out push for westward expansion. The coming mass migration of Americans from eastern settlements was further refined by fur trappers and traders, who exposed the routes that would later become part of the Oregon Trail, while enterprises such as the Hudson's Bay Company and the American Fur Company established trading posts and forts along the future trail, which in turn sparked additional exploration and mapping of potential routes west, adding a critical geographical understanding that proved the feasibility of an overland route to the Oregon Territory and beyond. By the 1820s and 30s, American settlers began to trickle west, thanks to mountain men like Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger, who discovered passes through seemingly insurmountable obstacles such as the Rocky Mountains. Early explorers also helped to define other trails heading west, including the California Trail, which branched off in southern Idaho for settlers and later miners headed to the gold fields of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the Mormon Trail, which paralleled much of the Oregon Trail before splitting off at Council Bluffs for Salt Lake City, and after the Civil War, the Bozeman Trail, which ran farther north through the Montana Territory. As for the Oregon Trail, the first major migration along the route began with a group of settlers known as the Peoria Party, who set out for Oregon in 1839 and did much to spread the word about the survivability of the journey and a better life out west. The Great Migration was further bolstered in 1843 when a group of some 1,000 settlers led by Marcus Whitman demonstrated that families could successfully traverse the Oregon Trail, which in turn opened up a floodgate of westward-bound settlers driven by economic opportunities, fertile lands, and the spirit of manifest destiny. The growing belief that the United States was destined to expand across the entirety of the North American continent. Beginning in the mid-1840s, an estimated 400,000 pioneers traversed the 2,000-mile-long trail in journeys that ranged from 4 to 6 months in length. For pioneers setting out on the Oregon Trail, ahead lay 7 major segments or landmarks that became crucial for navigation and survival. Provisioning in either Independence, St. Joseph's, or Council Bluffs, Missouri, settlers spent anywhere from $800 to $1,200 on supplies, some $47,000 in today's currency, usually raised through the sale of their possessions and eastern farms. Once a given wagon train had been organized, the first stop was Fort Kearny in present-day Nebraska, where they rested and resupplied for the push to Chimney Rock and Scotts Bluff, which were natural rock formations in western Nebraska that proved crucial for navigating the plains. Next came Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, which was a second critical rest and resupply point for westbound immigrants. Known as the Great Register of the Desert, Independence Rock in the Wyoming Territory was next, which was used as a navigational aid, as well as a place to record names and dates as pioneers passed by the crucial landmark. South Pass was next in the Wyoming Territory, which allowed prairie schooners, as they were known, to successfully traverse the Rocky Mountains. Fort Hall in present-day Idaho was another key resupply point for westward immigrants, as well as the jumping-off points for trails leading southwest to California and northwest to Oregon and Washington. For those headed to Oregon, the final segment was the Blue Mountains and the Columbia River, which tested the endurance and determination of many trail-weary pioneers. During the first half of the 19th century, the United States population witnessed a near 5-fold expansion due to high birth rates and a rising tide of immigration from Europe. Combined with the economic depressions of 1819 and 1839, westward migration exploded as Americans searched for new land and opportunities. The term manifest destiny first appeared in an editorial published in the Democratic Review in the summer of 1845, when a writer made criticism of the lingering opposition to the annexation of Texas from Mexico, urging readers toward a national unity for the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. That same summer, an article by John O'Sullivan in the New York Morning News referenced manifest destiny in light of the Oregon Territory, which was another vast swatch of land which American politicians and laymen alike were eager to assert control over. By the time the Oregon Territory joined the U.S. following a treaty with Great Britain, America was now embroiled in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, which was driven by the spirit of manifest destiny as pioneers freely encroached upon Mexican land. When war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 525,000 square miles were added to the United States land holdings, including what is now California, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. While the conquering spirit of manifest destiny witnessed a near stunning territorial expansion over the first half of the 19th century, the unrelenting westward spread of Americans not only led to war with Mexico, but also witnessed the wanton mistreatment and dislocation of Hispanics, Native Americans, at the same time fueling a contentious two-sided debate over which new territories and states would embrace the brutal institution of slavery, eventually leading a divided nation headlong into civil war. Originally built as a Catholic mission known as San Antonio de Valero, after the Spanish secularized El Alamo as Spanish soldiers renamed the fort in the early 1800s. During the opening stages of the Texas War of Independence from Mexico, by December 1835, volunteer Texan soldiers under the command of George Collinsworth and Benjamin Milham overwhelmed a garrison of Mexican soldiers stationed at the Alamo. When Colonel Jim Bowie and Lieutenant Colonel William B. Travis took command of the Alamo in mid-February 1836, despite protests by newly appointed Commander-in-Chief Sam Houston that forces at the Alamo lacked sufficient numbers to defend against a Mexican attack, more than 200 Texan volunteers, including legendary frontiersman and former Congressman Davy Crockett, vowed to defend the Alamo to the last. Their vow would come true during the 13-day Battle of the Alamo, when on February 23, 1836, a Mexican force made up of 1,800 to 6,000 men, led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, laid siege to the fort, suffering egregious losses, some 600 to 1,600 killed in action, before breaching the outer courtyard wall. Ordering his men to take no prisoners, only a handful of Texans would be spared in the slaughter that followed, save for a handful of Texans like Susanna Dickinson and her infant daughter, who were sent to Houston's camp at Gonzales as a warning against continued rebellion to Mexican rule. The Battle of the Alamo soon became a symbol of resistance and a rallying cry in the Texans' struggle for independence, while the phrase "Remember the Alamo" became a second battle cry as 800 Texan volunteers under Houston's command defeated Santa Anna's army on April 21, 1836. Houston's victory ensured independence for Texas, while the battle cry "Remember the Alamo" would once again rise in the American vernacular during the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, making the Battle of the Alamo one of the bloodiest events during America's deep embrace of manifest destiny. Before gold was discovered in 1848 Sutter's Mill, California, Native Californians had lived in relative peace for thousands of years, speaking up to 80 languages over a population base of some 150,000 people. That all changed during the steady arrival of white fortune seekers from back east, and when California became a state in 1850, the state's first governor, Peter Hardeman Burnett, like many white settlers, saw indigenous Californians as lazy, savage, and dangerous, informing his legislative brethren during the second State of the State address that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, and that while we cannot anticipate this result but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. Living up to his racist sentiments, Burnett gave a green light to the funding of local militias against California natives, enshrining into law the right for white citizens to arrest, enslave, or murder Native Californians. In a little-known act of ethnic cleansing, state militias raided tribal encampments, shooting and oftentimes scalping Native Americans, at the same time setting up bounty payments for white settlers that brought about the murder of 6,400 to 16,000 Native Californians between 1846 to 1873, while the U.S. Army took the lives of an additional 1,600 Native Californians. In many cases, the killing sprees wiped out entire tribal outposts, including the 1850 massacre of some 400 Pomo people, slaughtered by U.S. cavalrymen and local volunteers at Clear Lake, where a 6-year-old girl named Nika survived the ordeal by hiding in the lake and breathing through a reed. While many Native Californians died from the introduction of foreign diseases or enslavement, by the end of the slaughter in 1873, only 30,000 indigenous people remained, costing state coffers an estimated $1.7 million, a staggering sum at the time, to eradicate Native Americans from California soil. Still others were forced onto reservations, while Native children were forced to attend Indian assimilation schools. While California formally apologized for the genocide of Native Californians in 2019, the state also stands guilty of forced sterilizations of Mexicans during the state's eugenics movement of 1907 to 1964, as well as the discrimination and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War, making the genocide of 1846 to 1873 the first of many brutal injustices in California history. During the peak years of American westward expansion, under the banner of Manifest Destiny, a term coined by journalist John O'Sullivan, in 1845, the War Department sent U.S. Army Captain John C. Fremont on an expedition to survey the Great Basin and the Mexican possession of Alta California, drawing heightened concern from Mexican authorities, Native Americans, and American settlers concerned about their possible eviction from Mexican land. In response, on March 30, 1846, Fremont and his band of 65 white men and 11 Native Americans followed the banks of the Sacramento River in search of hostile Indians, reaching present-day Redding, California, on April 5th, where they stumbled upon some 1,000 Wintu people camped along the banks of the river. Considered one of the first acts of violence in the California genocide of Native Americans from 1846 to 1873, Fremont ordered his men, as one eyewitness recounts, to ask no quarter and to give none. And after Fremont's men flanked the encampment from 3 sides, pinning the Wintu along the river, they opened fire on a line of Wintu men who formed a defensive line in front of their women and children. Eyewitness Thomas C. Breckenridge later wrote that the settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. Estimates on the slaughter vary by account, from 175 to more than 700, with an additional 200 dying in the river as they attempted to flee the one-sided massacre. Kit Carson, one of the mounted attackers, later stated that the affair was a perfect butchery. Fremont and his group continued their killing spree up the Sacramento River, attacking the Klamath people in the Oregon Territory, resulting in the Klamath Lake Massacre of May 12, 1846, and the Sutter Buttes Massacre in early June. Despite his homicidal acts against Native Americans, Fremont would go on to become the military governor of California in 1847, followed by the first U.S. Senator from California in 1850. 6 years later, Fremont ran for president, losing to Democrat James Buchanan in the election of 1856, making the Sacramento River Massacre a little-known stain on one of the most legendary figures of the American West. It had been 10 years since Brigham Young had led his Latter-day Saints west to Utah, away from violent opposition in Missouri, and while the rest of the country wrestled with the question of slavery, Young was determined to build his Mormon kingdom in the deserts of Utah. While Salt Lake City comprised the second-largest city west of St. Louis, new colonies of Mormons stretched for 300 miles along the Wasatch Mountains. The Mormons printed their own currency, drove federal officials out of Utah, and publicly announced that plural marriage was part of church doctrine. The practice of polygamy turned many Americans against them, including political leaders in Washington, D.C. In the election of 1856, the newly formed Republican Party ran on what they called the twin relics of barbarism, calling for the abolition of both slavery and polygamy. The Republicans lost, but the issue of polygamy was kept alive by President Buchanan in an attempt to deflect attention from the growing issue of abolition and slavery. In an attempt to snuff out Mormon polygamy, in the summer of 1857, Buchanan sent 2,500 troops to Utah to reassert federal control. At the same time, a lone wagon train entered the southern part of Mormon territory. They were settlers mostly, families with small children, transiting the warmer Utah route on their way to California and a better life. On September 7, 1857, the wagon train reached the grassy knoll known as Mountain Meadows, and it was there that some 200 Paiute Indians, encouraged by the Mormons, attacked the wagon train. The immigrants managed to push the Indians back, while the Paiutes encouraged the Mormons to join in the fight to eliminate the pioneers. Elders sent a message to Brigham Young in Salt Lake City, asking what they should do. One of the men ordered to lead the fighting was John D. Lee, who later claimed that Young's original order, which he said was in writing, was to kill all the immigrants, which would act to discourage further Gentile settlements in Utah. At first, Lee refused to follow Young's orders on moral grounds, but in the end, John D. Lee decided to yield to Young's will. On the morning of September 11th, he rode out to the besieged wagon train under a flag of truce. Lee assured the immigrants that they had the Indians under control, and if they would throw down their arms, the Mormons would escort them to safety. After the immigrants complied, the order was given to their Mormon escorts to do your duty. The Mormons opened fire, each man assigned to shoot the immigrant walking next to him. Then the Paiutes swept in and finished off the rest. In less than a half hour, 120 people had been butchered by fellow Americans at Mountain Meadows. Only 17 children were spared, since they were thought too young to tell the horrible tale. After a hasty burial of the dead in shallow graves, 2 days later, Young's order to let the immigrants go arrived at Mountain Meadows, prompting John D. Lee to ride to Salt Lake City to inform the Young about the massacre, who in turn laid all blame on renegade Paiute Indians. Meanwhile, winter had stopped the Federal Army's advance, and the Mormon War ended before it really began. In a negotiated settlement, the president pardoned Young and his followers for inciting a rebellion against federal authority, effectively ending the attempt to divert the nation's attention from the issue of slavery. 4 years later, Brigham Young visited the site of the slaughter at Mountain Meadows, where outraged federal troops had erected a makeshift monument to the dead. On it were the words, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and I will repay." Young gazed at it for a time, before ordering the monument torn down. "Vengeance is mine," he muttered, "and I have taken a little." After the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, made lands north of the Arkansas River to the Nebraska border, the exclusive domain of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. The treaty broke down when gold was discovered in the Colorado Territory in 1858. By 1859, more than 100,000 Euro-American fortune seekers, known as 59ers, had poured onto Native American lands, ushering in a precipitous rise in hostilities by 1861. In an effort to curb the violence, on February 8th of that same year, Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle and several Arapaho leaders accepted the terms of the federal government's Treaty of Fort Wise, granting them 600 square miles of protected land to include a substantially reduced reservation along the Arkansas River to its northern boundary at Sand Creek. In June of 1864, Governor John Evans of the Colorado Territory, along with Colonel John M. Shivington of the U.S. Army and Fort Leon Commanding Officer Major Ned Wincoop, encouraged Black Kettle and his people to move their village to Sand Creek. Instead, in a bit of open treachery against Native Americans, at sunrise on November 29th, some 675 U.S. volunteer soldiers under Shivington's command attacked Black Kettle's Sand Creek encampment of some 750 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, employing small arms and artillery fire that slaughtered many of the villagers, particularly non-combatant women, children, and the elderly. Many who survived the initial attack fled across a dry creek bed and up a small rise, where soldiers shot at them as they struggled over sandy terrain. Those who managed to crest the small hilltop frantically dug pits and trenches to protect themselves, which drew further artillery fire over the next 8 hours, leading to the deaths of some 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people. The following day, soldiers returned to the site of the massacre, committing further atrocities on the dead before departing on December 1st to resume their campaign. In 2000, copies of letters from Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer were found in Denver, offering first-hand accounts of the massacre, which revealed that more than 100 men of the attacking U.S. volunteer soldiers stood in moral resistance to their orders, making the Sand Creek Massacre one of the darkest days in Native American history. During America's westward expansion, under her growing allegiance to manifest destiny, European American settlers began a steady march toward the Pacific, leaving residents living in the Mexican province of Alta California with a rising sense that their own government was too poor, unstable, and weak to staunch the flow of foreign invaders. At the same time, beginning in 1835, Americans like Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston led a rebellion in present-day Texas against Mexican rule, culminating 11 years later in the independent nation of the Republic of Texas, which in turn sparked the Mexican-American War of 1846, after land-grabbing President James Polk annexed Texas into the United States. 9 months before war broke out in earnest, President Polk sent John Fremont, a captain in the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, on an expedition to survey the Great Basin and the Great Salt Lake, at the same time secretly instructing the explorer and future politician to invade California if war was formally declared against Mexico, conveniently sending Fremont with a howitzer, just in case. Entering California in December of 1845, Fremont and his men skirmished with Mexican authorities, and when Fremont learned that war had at last broken out with Mexico, on June 13, 1846, he entered the Sonoma Valley with a ragtag group of settlers who had grown fearful that Mexican authorities would oust them from their land. After imprisoning Mexican General Mariano Vallejo at Sutter's Fort, the general quickly offered up his terms of surrender. Upon Vallejo's bloodless capitulation, the Americans announced the foundation of the California Republic, hastily stitching together a flag with a lone star and a grizzly bear that comically looked more like a hog than a bear, raising the flag over the barracks at Sonoma to announce the newly minted independent nation of California. known as bear flaggers or bears or osos in the Spanish. Fremont and his men engaged in further skirmishes with Mexican forces, while on July the 7th, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet, under the command of Commodore John Slout, seized Monterey, immediately claiming California as part of the United States. 2 days later, the Bear Flag Revolt ended when, for the most part, the marauding would-be revolutionaries came to their senses. California would ultimately be ceded to the United States in 1847 under the Treaty of Cahuenga, making the Bear Flag Revolt one of the most comical events in American history. The weather sweet spot for pioneers bound for California was mid to late April, but as ill fate would have it, the Donner Party, led by wealthy brothers Jacob and George Donner, failed to leave Independence, Missouri until May the 12th, giving them the dubious distinction of being the last major pioneer train of the 1846 season. "I am beginning to feel alarmed at the tardiness of our movements," one of the immigrants wrote, "and fearful that winter will find us in the snowy mountains of California." Most California-bound pioneers headed north through Idaho after reaching Wyoming, before turning south across Nevada, but the Donner brothers had fallen for a route proposed by a dishonest guidebook author named Lansford Hastings, who bragged of a shorter route across the Wasatch Mountains and the Salt Lake Desert. Despite the fact that no one had yet traveled the Hastings cutoff with wagons, the 20 wagons of the Donner Party set out for the cutoff, even after mountain man James Kleiman warned against such a divergence. For the brothers' arrogance or ignorance, the decision would add nearly a month to the wagon train's journey west. By early November 1846, the Donner Party reached the perilous slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains, a scant 100 miles from their intended destination, until an early blizzard stalled them in their tracks, forcing a retreat to Truckee Lake to ride out the winter in a ramshackle assembly of tents and hastily constructed cabins. A month into their encampment, on December 16, 1846, 15 able-bodied men strapped on homemade snowshoes and set out for help, only to wander aimlessly over the frozen landscape until they collapsed from starvation. After several in the party died of natural causes, the remaining men took to cannibalism, which allowed 7 to make it to a ranch in California where they organized rescue efforts that wouldn't commence until February of 1847. The last to be rescued was Prussian pioneer Louis Keseberg, who was located in April, half mad and surrounded by the cannibalized remains of his former associates. Of the 81 pioneers who were forced to winter at Truckee Lake, 45 eventually walked out alive. The Donner brothers would lose their wives and 4 children for their poor decision-making, and of the dozen families that made up the wagon train, only 2, the Reeds and the Breens, managed to arrive into California without suffering a single fatality. On January 24, 1848, James Wilson Marshall, a carpenter originally from New Jersey, found flakes of gold in the American River at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains near Coloma, California. At the time, Marshall was working to build a water-powered sawmill owned by John Sutter, and as Marshall later recalled of his historic find, "It made my heart thump, for I was certain it was gold." Though Marshall and Sutter tried to keep news of the discovery under wraps, word got out, and by mid-March, at least one newspaper was reporting that large quantities of gold were being turned up at Sutter's mill. By mid-June, some 3/4 of the male population of San Francisco had left town for the gold fields, and the number of miners in the area reached 4,000 by August. As news spread back east, potential fortune seekers remained skeptical at first, until President James K. Polk addressed a report by Colonel Richard Mason, California's military governor. The accounts of abundance of gold, Polk wrote, are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service. After Polk's pronouncement, the race was on in earnest, as mostly male fortune seekers borrowed money, mortgaged their properties, or spent their life savings to make the arduous journey west. Thousands of would-be gold miners, known as 49ers, traveled overland across the mountains or by sea, sailing through the Isthmus of Panama, or even around Cape Horn, the southernmost point of South America. By the end of the year, the non-native population of California was estimated at 100,000 people, compared with 20,000 at the end of 1848 and around 800 at the beginning of 48. To accommodate the needs of the 49ers, gold mining towns sprang up across the region, complete with price-gouging shops, saloons, brothels, and other business owners seeking to make their own gold rush fortunes. The overcrowded chaos in the mining camps and towns grew ever more lawless, including rampant stealing, gambling, prostitution, and violence. After 1850, the surface gold in California had largely been exhausted, even as would-be fortune seekers continued to arrive. As gold became more and more scarce on the surface, the growing industrialization of mining drove many fortune seekers from independence into hourly wage labor. The new technique of hydraulic mining, developed in 1853, brought enormous profits to mine owners, but destroyed much of the region's landscape in return. Though gold mining continued throughout the 1850s, it had reached its peak by 1852, when some $81 million was pulled from the ground, leveling off to around $45 million per year by 1857. Settlement in California continued, however, and by the end of the decade, the state's population topped out at 380,000 non-Native Americans, making the California Gold Rush a steady driver during America's push for westward expansion. After gold had been discovered in 1848 Sutter's Mill, California, several parties of westward-moving 49ers hauled small amounts of gold from Colorado's South Platte River, failing to report their find for several years due to their eagerness to reach the gold fields of California. A decade later, after a Georgian 49er named William Green Russell learned about the Colorado strike from his Cherokee wife, Russell set out for the region with 2 brothers and 6 others in February of 1858, unearthing the first significant gold deposits when they panned Little Dry Creek in July. When news of Russell's strike reached newspapers back east, by 1859, the Colorado Gold Rush would attract more than 100,000 fortune seekers to what was then part of the Kansas and Nebraska territory. Using the motto, "Pikes Peak or Bust," 59ers, as they were known, became the first significant non-native immigrants into the Rocky Mountain region, creating the second largest mining excitement in U.S. history, at the same time founding early towns such as Denver, Boulder, Breckenridge, and Central City, along with numerous smaller towns, leading to the creation of the Colorado Territory in 1861, followed by statehood in 1876. After the initial teaser discoveries of 1858, the Colorado Gold Rush reached its peak the following year, thanks to George Jackson's discovery of a substantial placer deposit near present-day Idaho Springs, followed by John Gregory's discovery of lode gold near Black Hawk in the summer of 1859. Quickly renamed Gregory Gulch, Gregory's initial discovery, soon to be the site of the Central City Mining District, quickly became known as the richest square mile on Earth. After placer deposits were largely exhausted by 1862, attempts at hydraulic lode mining, a highly successful technique during the California Gold Rush, proved mostly unattainable due to the Rockies' mountainous terrain and harsh winter conditions. After the end of the Civil War, however, Eastern investors turned their attention to the region in the form of in situ and pit mining. By the 1870s, Colorado's gold rush days were over, infusing some 375,000 ounces of gold into the American economy. As a secondary benefit, the infusion of capital investments and the arrival of the railroad opened a new age of growth and stability to the region, making the Colorado Gold Rush a time of boom or bust during the final years of a nation's westward migration. During a February 1861 speech in Ohio, President Abraham Lincoln said that a Homestead Act was worthy of consideration and that the wild lands of the country should be distributed so that every man should have the means and opportunity of benefiting his condition. At Lincoln's behest, Congress signed the Homestead Act into law on May 20, 1862, which would stand for the next 124 years, resulting in 10% of the nation's land claimed and settled by American pioneers and speculators. Open to all U.S. citizens and prospective citizens, the Homestead Act allowed settlers to obtain no more than 160 acres of land, which eventually saw 1.6 million deeds awarded, in the process forcing Native Americans onto designated reservations to make room for the flood of western-bound settlers. Homesteaders paid $12 up front, $10 for a temporary claim on their chosen land, plus a $2 commission to a land agent, followed by a $6 payment for a clear title, after certain conditions had been met. Before a clear land title could be obtained, homesteaders required 2 neighbors or friends to attest that the homesteader in question was 21 years of age, had lived continuously on the land for 5 years, while building a home or other structures to improve the land. Union soldiers, on the other hand, could circumvent and shorten the 5-year residency requirement by serving in the Civil War. Land titles could also be purchased outright for $1.25 per acre after 6 months of verified residency. In the end, due to ambiguous clauses in the Homestead Act and its congressional revisions, most of the land went to land speculators, cattlemen, miners, lumbermen, and railroads, a practice which was allowed to flourish due to a shortage of investigators. Of the 500 million acres dispersed by the General Land Office between 1862 and 1904, only 80 million acres went to homesteaders. For the most part, homesteading ended with the signing of the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, while the Homestead Act was finally repealed in 1976 with the signing of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which mandated that public lands be retained by the federal government. Homesteading was allowed to continue in Alaska for a decade more, making the Homestead Act an important instrument in westward American expansion. By the 1850s, thousands of American pioneers had settled west of the Rocky Mountains, making communication between family and friends back east a burdensome proposition at best. Before the Pony Express was brought into service, sending a letter to the 49ers in San Francisco took up to 8 weeks by ship, which meant a reply letter to the sender would not reach the eastern U.S. until 4 or more months had elapsed. When the Pony Express started its groundbreaking service, the communication lag time, provided a person could afford such a luxury, would drop from 8 weeks to 10 days. It all started on April 3, 1860, when 2 riders simultaneously embarked on a mirror-like mission, one from Sacramento heading east, the other from St. Joseph, Missouri heading west, carrying mail across the dangerous terrain of the American West. With riders weighing no more than 120 pounds, the first westbound rider made it to Sacramento in 10 days, while the first eastbound rider made it to St. Joseph in 11 and a half. Following the Oregon and California trails, the key to speedy delivery was a system of hundreds of way stations, where a total of 500 fresh horses and 80 riders could be continuously swapped out along the 1,800-mile route, one heading to Utah, while the other went to California. Pony Express riders wore red shirts with blue pants, carrying a mail bag no greater than 20 pounds. Way stations were placed every 10 to 15 miles for Pony Express riders to mount a fresh horse, while the riders themselves were swapped out every 75 to 100 miles, dependent upon terrain. Sending mail by Pony Express was a rich man's option only, since a half-ounce letter cost $5 to mail, or roughly $150 in today's money. 2 months after the Pony Express began, telegraph lines connecting the east and west coasts began to stitch their way across the American landscape. Heading west from Nebraska was the Pacific Telegraph Company, while the Overland's Telegraph Company built lines east from California until the lines joined up on October 24, 1861. On that same day, the first Transcontinental Telegraph Service issued its first dits and dots, spelling an end 2 days later to a brief, yet much romanticized period of rough-riding mailmen. A pounding rain took up on Christmas Eve of 1861, continuing unabated for the next 43 days of terror, panic, and death, transforming rivers running down from the Sierra Nevada mountains into raging spillways that swept away entire communities and mining settlements. Overflowing rivers poured water into the state's low-lying San Joaquin Valley, turning it into an inland sea 300 miles long, 20 miles wide, and 30 feet deep, drowning hundreds of thousands of cattle, while the human death toll, although never accurately accounted for, most likely rose into the thousands. Downtown Sacramento submerged under 10 feet of brackish water, forcing the state legislature to move to San Francisco until the city dried out. Destroying 25% of all California real estate, by the time the storm was over, the state of California was bankrupt. While the Central Valley took the brunt of the storm, much of the remaining west coast of America suffered egregious flooding and loss of property and life, only to worsen in the spring when melting mountain snowpack brought on a second round of torrential flooding. Marysville, Santa Rosa, Auburn, parts of Sonora, Nevada City, and Napa were all underwater, while smaller towns like Empire City and Mokelumne City were simply erased from the face of the earth. Even in Los Angeles, the LA, San Gabriel, and Santa Ana rivers all flooded and merged, creating an inland sea 18 miles wide. Further inland in Riverside, the Santa Ana River completely washed away the small town of Aguamanza near present-day Colton. In the Mojave Desert, Owens Valley was also devastated by floods, causing great misery among the Paiute people, since the game animals they relied upon for food had drowned and washed away. The storm also paused the Civil War effort in the Pacific Coast Theater, which had been heating up in the months leading up to the protracted storm. Now that the Central Valley is home to 6 million Californians, on land producing crops worth $20 billion annually, meteorologists and climatologists have studied sediment deposits in widespread locations, which indicate the region has received similar storms every 2 centuries, going back at least over the past 2,000 years. Caused by atmospheric rivers that build over the Pacific Ocean, generally 1,000 miles in length and 250 miles wide, in a predictive model known as ArcStorm, which was updated and revised in 2022. Scientists believe a repeat of the storm of 1862 is well overdue. Modeling a relentless yet shorter storm lasting 23 days, such an event would cause $400 billion in property and agricultural losses, not to mention mass evacuations from low-lying areas, making the Great California Flood of 1862 a long-forgotten nightmare during the early history of the Golden State. Considered one of the first great engineering marvels of the 19th century, a century that would dazzle a nation with its emerging ability to dream and build big things, the first Transcontinental Railroad opened enormous economic opportunities into the American West, despite its consumption of untold natural resources, at the same time birthing new life on the Great Plains while destroying another. Traversing the vast expanse of western lands, pioneers encountered a myriad of obstacles, including the Great American Desert, which spans from halfway across Nebraska out to the Rocky Mountains. Considered a no-man's land, replete with bitterly harsh conditions, immigrants in prairie schooners forged across America at no more than 20 miles per day before connecting with western routes such as the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. After trains made the audacious prospect of a cross-country railroad a viable possibility, in 1845, New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney approached Congress about funding a railroad to the Pacific, which failed due to rising sectionalism over the issue of slavery. Despite the deadlock in Congress, in 1860, a young engineer by the name of Theodore Judah, one of the first civil engineers in the country, identified the infamous Donner Pass in Northern California as the best location for a railroad to transit the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains, leading Judah to enlist a group of Sacramento investors to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. As good luck and good timing would have it, Washington lawmakers were about to realize the true power of the railroad. In July of 1861, 3 months after the Confederate Army's attack on Fort Sumter, the first major battle of the Civil War took place at Bull Run, Virginia. Fully expecting a quick win for the North, that all ended when 11,000 Confederate reinforcements arrived by train, handing Lincoln and his generals an embarrassing early defeat. As a protracted war looked more and more likely, a rail line into the American West became critically important during Westward Expansion, primarily to ensure that new Western territories would remain with the Union. 3 months later, now funded by American investment money, Judah traveled to Washington, where he convinced President Abraham Lincoln and key members of Congress to sign the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, which stipulated that the Central Pacific Railroad Company would commence construction of railroad tracks heading east from Sacramento, while a second company, the Union Pacific Railroad, would concurrently lay tracks westward from the Missouri River near the Iowa-Nebraska border. With plans to meet up somewhere in the middle, each company would receive 6,400 acres of land, later doubled to 12,800, as well as $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track laid. Management of the Central Pacific was soon snapped up by ambitious businessmen now known as the Big Four: Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins, who preferred to be known as the Associates. All four men lacked any knowledge or experience with railroads, engineering, or construction, yet they pushed headlong into their task by borrowing heavily to finance their efforts, while exploiting legal loopholes to maximize funding by the U.S. government in the name of American progress. Judah, on the other hand, soon became disillusioned with his partners and traveled east to solicit new investors into the Union Pacific until he died of yellow fever on November 2nd of 1863 due to his transit across the Isthmus of Panama. Struggling to retain workers due to the backbreaking nature of working in the high Sierras, construction manager Charles Crocker took advantage of some 50,000 Chinese immigrants who fled the Guangdong province in the face of floods, famine, and political unrest caused by the Red Turban Rebellion. Willing to work tirelessly in brutal conditions for very little pay, by early 1867, Crocker had hired some 14,000 Chinese workers who blasted their way through the mountains, including the construction of enormous wooden trestles and long tunnels through solid granite rock. Progress remained painstakingly slow, however, and by the time the Central Pacific had cleared the Sierras in late June of '67, the Union Pacific had already reached Wyoming, nearly 4 times the distance as the Central Pacific. After a 6-year struggle and nearly 21 million sledgehammer swings since President Lincoln authorized the creation of a cross-country railroad, by early 1869, With both companies only miles apart from each other, newly seated President Ulysses S. Grant threatened to withhold federal funding until the two companies agreed upon a meeting point. They chose Promontory Summit, just north of Salt Lake City, some 690 track miles east of Sacramento and 1,086 miles west of Omaha. And on May the 10th, after repeated delays, a crowd of workers and dignitaries witnessed the Golden Spike Ceremony, as it became known, which constituted the final spike that connected the two companies' tracks. A gift from David Hughes, a San Francisco contractor and friend of Big Four member Leland Stanford. Stanford took the first swing at the spike, but when he hit the tie instead, Durant missed a second attempt, most likely due to his raging hangover following a celebratory party the night before. A railroad worker finally drove in the spike at 12:47 p.m., whereupon a telegram went out to President Grant and news outlets around the country. Soon replaced by a conventional iron spike, the Golden Spike is now part of a collection at Stanford University, which was founded in 1885 by Leland and his wife Jane. Considered one of the grandest accomplishments in world history, the country went wild after the news broke, firing off more cannons in celebration than were fired during the Battle of Gettysburg. Prior to its completion, a cross-country journey could take up to 6 months and thousands of dollars to travel from New York to San Francisco, but with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the journey now took a mere week at a cost of a couple of $100, all in the safety of a railway car, opening up the American West to a less rugged diaspora of Americans. Connecting the two American coasts also opened a floodgate of exported Western resources into Eastern markets, at the same time accelerating conflicts between Native Americans and the flood of new settlers who now had easy access to the American West. Over the next 5 years, over 350,000 people ventured across the country on the Transcontinental Railroad, along with the equivalent of more than $102 billion in freight in today's currency. Now considered a technological demonstration of manifest destiny, the first cross-country railroad also exposed a remarkable capacity for human greed, corruption, and unbridled violence, making Crocker and Durant incredibly wealthy in the process, reaping some $2.3 and $3.6 billion respectively, again in today's currency. They also received land grants of more than 175 million acres, which comprises more land than the state of Texas, while a century later, the Union Pacific bought all of their competitors for a combined 32,000 track miles throughout the nation, moving 1.7 billion tons annually, valued at hundreds of billions of dollars, making the first transcontinental railroad a giant leap forward in the unification of a nation. After its loss to Great Britain during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, Russian officials feared losing their remote and weakly defended Alaska territory to further British aggression, at the same time fearing their loss of the territory to the same brand of American expansionism that saw the loss of Texas from Mexico. In response, Russia's minister to the U.S., Edward de Stockel, commenced negotiations with pro-expansionist Secretary of State William H. Seward, and while the American public believed Alaska to be a frozen swatch of wasteland, when the U.S. formally took possession of Alaska on October 18, 1867, critics were quick to call it Seward's Folly, or Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, due to the latter's broad unpopularity amongst American voters. The purchase added 586,412 square miles to the United States, nearly twice the size of Texas, all at a cost of $7.2 million, or less than 2 cents an acre. Public opinion would shift dramatically when gold was discovered in 1899, sparking a gold rush that exposed fortune seekers to temperatures as low as minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The territory achieved statehood on January 3, 1959, which today accounts for more than 25% of American oil extraction and over 50% of all seafood consumed in the United States. While Alaska comprises the largest state by landmass, it sports a hardy population of only 732,000 people, with more than half that number living in the Anchorage metro area alone. Each year, Alaskans celebrate the Alaska Purchase with two official state holidays: Seward's Day, observed on the last Monday of March, which marks the signing of the land agreement between the U.S. and Russia, while October 18th celebrates the anniversary of the formal land transfer, making the Alaska Purchase yet another massive acquisition in a nation's full embrace of manifest destiny. Following the Opium Wars against Great Britain, China's crushing war debt, combined with a protracted stretch of floods and droughts that left many Chinese peasants seeking new opportunities abroad. Many Chinese found their way into California after James Wilson Marshall's 1848 discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill. Combined with another devastating crop failure in China, some 20,000 Chinese immigrants passed through San Francisco's Customs House in 1852, up from 2,716 the previous year, igniting a racially charged spree of violence by whites who saw the Chinese as a threat to their ongoing ability to earn a living wage. Later that same year, in an effort to curb the violence and allay the fears of white miners, California imposed a foreign miners' tax of $3 a month, despite the fact that Chinese laborers worked for less money and longer hours than whites, often given the most dangerous and backbreaking jobs in a given mining operation. To worsen the plight of Chinese immigrants, the 1854 Supreme Court case of People v. Hall ruled that the Chinese, like African Americans and Native Americans before them, were no longer allowed to testify in an American courtroom, further limiting their ability to seek justice against the rising flood of white-inspired violence. During construction of the first Transcontinental Railroad, after Charles Crocker and other founders of the Central and Southern Pacific Railroads placed employment ads for white workers, when only a few hundred white men applied, Crocker began hiring less expensive Chinese workers to fill the labor vacuum. Before the tracks came together at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10, 1869, some 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese laborers had almost single-handedly built one of the greatest engineering achievements in American history, working from sunup to sundown 6 days a week, all for $26 a month. Signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act furthered the nation's racist tenor by suspending all Chinese immigration for a 10-year period, at the same time excluding Chinese Americans already in the country from seeking naturalization as U.S. citizens. And while Chinese Americans challenged the constitutionality of the law in court, all of their efforts failed to bring about justice. The immigration ban was extended an additional 10 years thanks to the Geary Act of 1892, followed by the Immigration Act of 1924, which extended the nation's exclusionary practices to not only the Chinese, but other undesirable groups such as Hindus, Middle Easterners, and the Japanese. Chinese immigration into the U.S. plummeted as a result, until the Magnuson Act of 1943 at long last made Chinese Americans eligible for U.S. citizenship. And there you have it, American Westward Expansion, today in the Daily Dose. If you enjoyed today's Daily Dose and want us to create more documentaries like this one, please give it a thumbs up or a super thanks. If you're aware of a piece of American or military history that is underreported, please comment below because we read every comment and would love to hear which subjects interest you most. To learn more about this subject, consider reading the filmmaker's book Westward Rising Suns, which you can find in the description below.